In 1971, Seattle's desperation was so complete that someone put up a billboard that read, "Will the last person leaving turn out the lights?" 60,000 Boeing jobs were gone. Unemployment hit 14%, double the national rate. Houses sold for half their value, and whole families fled. But in those empty streets and cheap apartments, something unexpected began. What was it really like to live through Seattle's collapse? And how did this broken city become transformed? A single sign on the highway said it all. Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights? The numbers behind that black humor were staggering. Between 1969 and 1971, Boeing cut 60,000 jobs, almost two-thirds of its workforce. That was not just an aerospace story. It was nearly half the region's economy, gone in less than 2 years. By 1971, unemployment in Seattle reached 14%. The national rate hovered around 4.5%. But here it felt like the bottom had dropped out. House prices collapsed. Homes that once sold for $25,000 were now listed for half that, and often sat empty. Over 100,000 people packed up and left the region, neighbors and classmates and entire families disappearing almost overnight. Downtown blocks filled with boarded-up windows and for-lease signs. The city's population, which had boomed through the 1960s, actually shrank. One machinist, after picking up his last paycheck, said he walked out and it was like the whole plant had gone silent. You could hear your own footsteps echo. For those who stayed, the city felt hollowed out, streets quieter, paychecks uncertain, hope in short supply. Yet in that silence, something raw and honest settled over Seattle. The knowledge that nothing was guaranteed, and that survival would mean starting from scratch. Rent checks in the early 70s stretched further than anyone today might believe. A studio apartment in Capitol Hill or Ballard could be yours for $85 a month, maybe $120 if you wanted a little more space. Even with paychecks drying up, the low cost of living was its own kind of relief. Grocery lists reflected the numbers. A gallon of milk for $1.30, ground beef at 89 cents a pound, apples and potatoes still cheap enough to fill a brown paper bag for a couple of dollars. The corner store was a lifeline, not a luxury. Inside, homes wore the decade like a badge, wood paneling on the walls, shag carpeting in burnt orange or avocado green underfoot. Kitchens buzzed with the sound of percolators and the smell of drip coffee. Living rooms revolved around a hulking TV console and a stack of vinyl records, the kind of setup where families gathered nightly, not just for entertainment, but for comfort. Evenings meant stretching leftovers, clipping coupons, and swapping stories about who'd found the best deal that week. Getting around, the streets belonged to Datsuns, Ford Pintos, and Volkswagen Beetles, small, practical cars that fit the mood of the times. Gas was cheap until the crisis hit. For a while, a full tank meant freedom, or at least the hope of it. One renter remembers scraping together enough for rent and groceries, then driving through nearly empty streets, the city feeling both wide open and strangely intimate. Hardship was everywhere, but so was a stubborn sense of possibility, tucked into every thrift store couch and handwritten shopping list. Pike Place Market nearly vanished in 1971. The city had plans to bulldoze most of it for hotels and parking garages, calling the old market a fire trap. But vendors, artists, and neighborhood regulars weren't about to let their gathering place disappear. They set up petition tables, passed out flyers, and filled the streets with daffodil marches. By November, over 50,000 signatures stacked up behind a ballot initiative. On Election Day, Seattle voted to save the market by a 3-2 margin. That wasn't just a win for nostalgia. It was a victory for everyone who believed the city's soul lived in its messy, crowded corners. In the middle of all this, a tiny shop opened on Western Avenue, just below the market. Starbucks, founded by three coffee lovers, sold only beans and brewing gear, no lattes, no espresso bar, just the smell of roasting coffee drifting out onto the sidewalk. The market's preservation gave space for newcomers like this, side by side with fishmongers and flower sellers. A year earlier, the first Earth Day at the University of Washington drew crowds for teach-ins and speeches about pollution and conservation. That spring, neighbors started organizing recycling drives, card tables in church parking lots, barrels for newspapers and glass jars, all run by volunteers. The city didn't have blue bins yet, but the idea caught on. Trash could be a resource, and taking care of the land was everyone's job. In Seattle, saving the market and sorting bottles felt like different sides of the same fight. Ordinary people refusing to let their city be sold off or paved over. Nightlife belonged to anyone with a guitar, a basement, and a little nerve. Empty storefronts and cheap rent meant that on any given Friday, the Showbox's underground rooms echoed with bands hauling battered amps up narrow stairs, playing to crowds who paid a couple bucks at the door. The Showbox wasn't polished. Its sticky floors and low ceilings made it feel like a secret you were lucky to stumble into. Over in the University District, the Blue Moon Tavern filled with poets, painters, and musicians, all drawn by the promise of cheap beer and even cheaper conversation. The walls, stained by decades of cigarette smoke, seemed to soak up every story and song. KZAM-FM spun progressive rock late into the night. Its playlist's a lifeline for anyone tired of top 40 radio. You could walk into a bar and hear Yes or Genesis on the speakers, then catch a local band trying out their own sound just a few feet away. Flyers for gigs, hand-drawn and photocopied and tacked to telephone poles, mapped out a circuit of venues from Pioneer Square to Capitol Hill. Rehearsal spaces hid in old warehouses where musicians worked out new material, surrounded by the hum of broken refrigerators and the rattle of the freight trains outside. One musician remembers that you could rent a whole house with your band for $100 each and turn the basement into a studio. No one cared how loud you got. The city's emptiness became a playground for anyone willing to make some noise. Out of that freedom, a new kind of community took root. A scene built on shared hardship, thrift store instruments, and the stubborn belief that something better could be made out of nothing. The winter of 1973 brought a new kind of headache to Seattle drivers. When the Arab oil embargo hit, gas lines wrapped around the block. Paydays and weekends were the worst. People sat in their Datsuns and Pintos, engines off, inching forward as attendants flipped signs from open to no gas by early afternoon. Police cruised the streets, tapping on windows if you left your car idling too long. Some stations started turning away anyone they thought was just joyriding, saving what fuel they had for those who claimed they needed it for work. Buses were no sure bet either. Metro transit was still finding its footing, and budget cuts meant fewer routes and longer waits. If your bus did not show, you waited. Ferries to Bainbridge or Bremerton kept running, but commuters grumbled about fare hikes and tighter schedules, feeling the pinch as fuel costs soared. The Alaskan Way Viaduct and Interstate 5 still moved traffic, but every trip felt like a calculation. Could you make it through the week on half a tank? One commuter remembers this. You would plan your errands by which stations might still have gas, and sometimes you just stayed home. For families already stretched thin, the oil shock was another daily reminder that the old routines were gone, replaced by a new kind of uncertainty. Even as the city's nerves frayed from layoffs and gas lines, a handful of steady anchors kept Seattle's heart beating. The port of Seattle still loaded ships day and night, its cranes moving containers bound for Alaska and Asia, keeping thousands on payroll when other industries faltered. Across town, the University of Washington stayed open for business, hiring researchers, training doctors, and giving students a reason to stick around. REI, once just a co-op for mountain climbers, quietly grew as the city's love for the outdoors deepened, its membership swelling through word of mouth and battered hiking boots. Something new was brewing, too. In April 1975, Microsoft filed its incorporation papers just outside Seattle, a small software outfit in a region desperate for fresh ideas. A year later, the kingdom opened its concrete doors, promising Seattle a place to gather and cheer. The Mariners took the field for the first time in 1977, and by 1979, the SuperSonics had lifted a championship trophy, giving the city a moment of pride. Through it all, these institutions, old and new, offered jobs, hope, and a reason to believe that Seattle could build more than airplanes. Seattle's spirit was forged in scarcity, a city remade by those who stayed and built anyway. That resilience echoes now as rising costs and new challenges test what's possible here. The question remains, who shapes Seattle's future when survival once again demands creativity over comfort? Share your memories below.